My lawyer called me at 6:52 on a Tuesday morning, which was strange enough on its own, because Harold Benning did not call before 8, ever, in the 11 years I'd known him. Not even the year my wife's estate cleared probate, and there were 4 separate filing deadlines in 1 week. I was standing in my garage in Tulsa, Oklahoma, refilling the oil in my truck before the sun got hot, and I picked up on the first ring because a lawyer calling before 7 means the thing he's calling about didn't wait for a decent hour to happen. He said, "Walt, I need you to come to the office this morning. Not the usual conference room. My private office. Can you be here at 9? I said, "Harold, what's going on?" He said, "I'd rather you sit down first." I told him I'd be there. I finish the oil change because that's who I am. I finish what I start, even when my hands are shaking a little. And mine were, just slightly. In a way I didn't examine too closely at the time. I put my tools away. I let the dog in. I drove downtown. Harold met me in the hallway, instead of having his assistant walk me back, which was the second thing that told me this was not a normal Tuesday. He shut the door behind us. He sat down across from me instead of behind his desk, which was the third thing. Then he slid a thick envelope across the low table between us and said, "Walt, I received a copy of a revised trust document yesterday. It's been filed with the county recorder. It has your signature on every page." I looked at the envelope. I did not open it right away because some part of me already understood that once I did, I would not be able to go back to not knowing. He said, "Walt, I did not draft this. I have never seen this document before yesterday afternoon. And your signature on it does not match your signature on the original trust I drew up for you and Carol in 2016. I had our paralegal compare them side by side. They are close. They are not the same hand." I opened the folder. The first page was a full restatement of the Coleman family trust, the trust Carol and I built together over 30 years, the one that held the house on Birch Street, my half of Coleman Freight Solutions, and the lake property up at Grand Lake that Carol's father had left us. The new document named a different successor trustee, not our son Michael, not our daughter Renee. It named my son-in-law, Todd Prescott, as sole successor trustee and primary beneficiary of the freight company shares, effective immediately upon what the document called a determination of the grantor's diminished capacity. I turned the page. There was a supporting letter on letterhead that looked almost exactly like the letterhead of Dr. Ann Whitfield, my physician of 19 years, describing what it called early-stage cognitive decline, consistent with vascular dementia, dated 3 months earlier. I had never had that appointment. I had never had those symptoms. I walk 5 miles a day on the river trail, and I still do our company's quarterly numbers by hand before I let the accountant touch them, because I like to know the shape of the business before someone else's software tells me what shape it's in. I said, "Harold, I've never been evaluated for anything like this in my life." He said, "I know, Walt. That's why I called Ann Whitfield's office myself before I called you. Her office has no record of that appointment. None. She's furious. She's already contacted the state medical board." I said, "Someone forged my signature and my doctor's letterhead to steal my company out from under me." He said, "Yes." I said, "Who filed it?" Harold pulled a single page from the side of the folder. He said the trust amendment had been submitted by an attorney representing Todd Prescott, acting, the filing said, on behalf of the beneficiary's father-in-law, out of concern for his welfare. Todd, my daughter Renee's husband of 9 years. The man who'd sat at my Thanksgiving table every year since 2017 and asked me every single time how the fishing had been. I set the folder down slow, the way you set down something you don't trust yourself, not to crush. I looked out Harold's window at Boston Avenue, at the ordinary Tulsa morning going on without any idea what had just landed on the table between us. Harold said, "I've already sent a formal notice to the county recorder's office flagging the filing as disputed pending investigation. I called the trust department at First Oklahoma Bank to freeze any transfer requests tied to the Coleman trust accounts. And Walt, I want you to hear this part directly. Whoever did this used my former paralegal's old template formatting to make this look like it came out of this office. They tried to make it look like I helped him. He picked up his phone right there in front of me and dialed his assistant. He said, 'Denise, pull every Coleman trust file we have.' To the full history, back to 2016, and get me a certified copy within the hour. We're going to need it. He hung up and looked at me and said, "What do you need from me, Walt?" I said, "Everything you just started, and one more thing." He said, "Name it." I said, "Don't let him walk this back quietly." Harold said, "Walt, I've been practicing law in this state for 29 years. I have never once let anybody walk anything back quietly." I took the folder. I stood up. I shook his hand, and I walked out through the waiting room into a June morning that had no business being that bright, and I stood on the sidewalk on Boston Avenue for a minute with the folder under my arm, and I thought about the fact that Todd Prescott had asked me last month, over coffee at my kitchen table, whether I'd ever thought about simplifying things for Renee's sake now that Carol wasn't around to help me keep track. I hadn't felt insulted at the time. I'd felt touched. That's the part that sat wrong in my chest, hardest of all. Not that he'd tried to steal from me, but that I'd sat there and thanked him for his concern. I didn't feel rage standing on that sidewalk, and I want you to understand that, because it matters to how the rest of this goes. What I felt was something colder and a lot more useful. I spent 34 years running a freight logistics company before I sold my majority stake and stayed on as a minority partner and consultant. You don't survive 3 decades in freight without learning that anger doesn't move trucks and it doesn't win disputes. What moves things is documentation, timing, and knowing exactly where every piece of paper in your life is filed before you ever need it. I felt that part of me switch on, the part that had spent 34 years reading manifests and contracts, and knowing when a number didn't add up before anybody told me why. Todd had made one enormous mistake. He'd spent 2 years positioning himself around a widower he thought was getting soft and sentimental and forgetful. What he'd actually been circling was a man who still reconciled his own bank statements by hand every single month out of habit, and who kept a filing cabinet that a federal auditor could run through in under 20 minutes. He had no idea, and he had about 3 weeks before he found out. Hey, before I get into the rest of it, let me tell you a little about who I am, because it matters for what comes later. My name's Walt Coleman. I'm 66. I built Coleman Freight Solutions out of a single leased truck and a folding table in a rented office on 21st Street in 1987. By the time I sold the majority stake in 2019, we had 6 terminals across 3 states and 41 trucks running under our name. I stayed on doing consulting because retirement, to me, never sounded like sitting still. It sounded like finally having time to do the parts of the business I actually liked, which was the numbers, the routes, the puzzle of making something run efficient. Carol and I bought the house on Birch Street in 1994, a low brick ranch with a good porch and a pecan tree. Carol planted the year our son was born. Carol taught high school biology for 26 years and could diagram a logical fallacy in a student's essay faster than most people could find their car keys. She was also the warmest person in any room, and I never did figure out how a person managed both of those things at once, but she did, every day, for 39 years. Carol was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 2022 and passed at home in October of 2023, in the bedroom we'd shared for almost 4 decades, with Michael and Renee both there. I'm not going to dwell on that morning. What I will tell you is that the house on Birch Street has been quieter since, and I've learned to manage that quiet the same way I learned to manage everything else in my life. You account for it, you build around it, you don't pretend it isn't there. We had 2 kids. Michael's 42, lives in Dallas, works as a structural engineer, calls me every Sunday evening without fail, and drove up 3 separate weekends, the winter after Carol passed, just to sit with me. No reason given, none needed. Renee's 39. She lives 20 minutes from me here in Tulsa, married to Todd Prescott for 9 years, and they've got a boy, my grandson Caleb, who's 7 and who I coach in T-ball on Saturday mornings. Renee's got her mother's sharpness. She just spent a good part of the last decade pointed in a direction her mother would have had questions about. She's not a bad person. I want to be real clear about that up front, the same way I've had to be clear about it with myself. She married a man whose particular kind of charm slowly recalibrated what she thought was normal, and I watched it happen for years, without moving fast enough to say something. Todd Prescott is 43. He's a financial planner, with an office in a nice building off Utica Square. Good suit, good handshake, remembers your kid's birthday and your dog's name after meeting you once. Carol figured him out inside of 20 minutes at the first dinner we ever had with him and Renee back in 2015. She didn't make a scene. She waited until we were in the car and she said, "Walt, that man does math on everybody he meets." I told her I saw it too. She said she knew I did. The early years were smooth on the surface. They bought a house in Broken Arrow in 2018. Caleb came along in 2019. They showed up for every holiday at Birch Street, and Todd was always exactly calibrated, warm, attentive, remembered the little things. What I started noticing, and logging without acting on, began around 2021. Questions about whether the freight company's minority shares were properly structured for tax efficiency. Comments about whether Carol and I had modernized our estate plan. An offer, phrased as a favor, to look over my investment accounts, since he did this professionally anyway. The pattern of a man circling something valuable like he already half-owned it. Carol clocked it too. She said to me one night in late 2022, sitting up in bed with the little spiral notebook she kept in the nightstand, "Walt, make sure everything is somewhere, you know exactly where it is, and make sure Michael knows too." I didn't understand the specific urgency of that sentence at the time. I understood it fully about 8 months after she died, when Todd started asking, gently, whether I'd thought about a power of attorney, just so things are simple for everybody. I was walking 5 miles a day on the river trail. My last physical had come back clean across the board. I understood in that moment the question wasn't about my well-being. What I didn't understand yet was how far he'd already gone. I found out for certain the morning Harold Benning called me at 6:52. I drove from Harold's office straight to the office of Marjorie Kessler, an elder law and trust litigation attorney 2 floors above a title company on South Cincinnati Avenue. Harold had told me about her 3 years back, when I'd asked him, almost as an afterthought, whether he knew anyone who handled contested guardianships and trust disputes, if it ever came to that. He'd said, "I know exactly one person in this city who wins those consistently, and her name is Marjorie Kessler, and she doesn't do consultations by appointment, you just show up." I filed that the way I file everything, in a place I could find it fast when I needed it. Marjorie was in her mid-50s, built like someone who doesn't waste words or steps. Her office had a whiteboard with 3 case timelines on it in 3 different colors of marker. She was on a call when her assistant walked me in. She held up one finger, finished the call in under a minute and said, "Sit. What's happened?" I sat. I put the folder on her desk. I told her my son-in-law had filed a fraudulent trust amendment, naming himself successor trustee, backed up by forged medical documentation attributed to my own physician, and that the physician had already disavowed it that same morning. Marjorie looked at the folder without touching it yet. She said, "How do you know it's forged?" I said, "Because I've never been evaluated for cognitive decline in my life, and because my doctor's office has no record of the appointment described in that letter, and she's already reported it to the medical board herself," Marjorie said. "And can you account for your whereabouts on the date of the supposed evaluation?" I said, "March 4th. I was in Dallas at my son's house for his birthday. I've got the hotel folio, the toll records, and my son will testify to it in person if it comes to that." She looked at me for a second and said, "What'd you do for a living, Mr. Coleman?" I said, "Ran a freight company for 34 years. She said, "That explains the toll records." She pulled the folder toward her and read it in total silence for almost 2 minutes, turning each page slow and deliberate, and when she closed it, she looked at the wall for a second before she spoke. She said, "Mr. Coleman, this is elder fraud, plain and simple, and if these documents are what they look like, your son-in-law has committed fraud on the county recorder, fraud against you personally, and fraudulent misuse of a licensed physician's identity. Those are 3 separate felonies in this state," I said. "I know," she said. "What outcome do you want?" I said, "I want that amendment voided and thrown out permanently. I want the forged documents on a record that follows Todd Prescott for the rest of his career, and I want to be standing in a room when he finds out it didn't work." Marjorie sat with that a second, then said, "Those are all achievable." She picked up her pen and said, "Tell me everything, start to finish, and don't skip anything you think doesn't matter. I'll decide what matters." I talked for almost 50 minutes. She wrote the entire time and never once interrupted. When I finished, she asked 3 things. Did Todd have any legitimate authority over any of my accounts right now? None. I'd updated every beneficiary designation myself after Carol passed, and Michael was named successor on everything real. Did Renee know what Todd had done? I told her I honestly didn't know, and that I wanted to find out before I assumed anything either way. Did I have any written record of the conversations where Todd had raised power of attorney or trust changes? I said, I keep a business journal. Every substantive conversation I've had for the past 15 years is in there, dated. I've got entries going back to the first time he brought it up. Marjorie set her pen down and said, Mr. Coleman, I've handled 26 of these cases in this county. Maybe 3 clients in all that time walked in with what you just handed me. I said, 34 years running a freight company teaches you that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. The first call Marjorie made from her desk, with me sitting right there, was to the county recorder's office to formally file notice of a dispute on the trust amendment, which immediately froze any further action on it. The second call was to a private investigator named Ray Ostrander, who ran a small operation out of a converted warehouse near the Arkansas River. He was around 60, wore the same brown jacket to every meeting I ever had with him, and cared more about what was true than what anybody paid him to find. He called Marjorie back 3 days later with what he'd found, and it wasn't a crime of opportunity, it was an architecture. Todd had spent nearly 2 years researching Oklahoma trust and guardianship law. He'd found a document preparation service out of Broken Arrow that produced convincing template, medical, and legal forms. He'd built 4 fabricated interactions with Dr. Whitfield's office that never happened, and he'd lifted her actual signature from a real prescription authorization letter she'd written for Carol during her illness, a letter that had passed through our house during the estate settlement. He used my dead wife's medical paperwork to steal her own doctor's signature. I sat with that fact for a long time when Marjorie told me, because I needed to. Ray also found that Todd had opened a business account at a bank in Broken Arrow under an entity called Prescott Family Holdings, LLC, registered 8 months earlier, stated purpose, family asset management services, no clients, no revenue, nothing in it. Marjorie looked at that account a long moment and said, he built the container before he built the fraud. He expected you to just get processed through. I said, he's known me 9 years. She said, he saw what he wanted to see. A widower, alone, getting older. He didn't do the math on the right variables. I said, my wife told me he was always doing math. Marjorie said, she was right. Wrong math, though. I have to tell you about the call with Renee separately, because it's the part of this whole thing that cost me the most, and the part I've turned over in my head more than any other since. I called her on a Wednesday evening, 10 days before the hearing Marjorie had gotten scheduled. I told her to just listen first before she said anything, and then I told her everything, the folder, the forged letter, the empty LLC, the 2 years Ray had traced. All of it, straight through, no stopping. When I finished, the line went quiet long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. She said, Dad, I didn't know about any documents. I swear to you I didn't know he'd done that. I said, what did you know? She said, he told me he'd started some paperwork to protect you, because you were alone now and getting older, and that you'd probably push back at first because you're stubborn about needing help. He showed me a summary, not the whole thing. He said the legal parts were too technical to bother me with. I sat with that phrase a second, too technical to bother her with, which is exactly the kind of thing a man says when he needs his wife compliant and uninformed at the same time. I said, Renee, are you going to stand behind what he did, or are you going to tell the truth about what you actually knew? A long silence. Then, quiet. I'll tell the truth. Whatever it costs me. I said, meet with Marjorie tomorrow morning. Bring everything, texts, emails, all of it. She said, I have texts, Dad. A lot of them. I said, I know. And Renee, I love you, and that's not up for negotiation over any of this. But what Todd did is a crime. And what you do in the next 10 days matters a lot for what happens after. She said, quiet. I know, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions. I said, ask them from here on out. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table a long while, thinking about something Carol used to say about Renee, that she had my stubbornness and Todd's blind spots in exactly the wrong proportions, and that she'd find her way out eventually if we gave her room. I'd given her room. She found it. Marjorie met with Renee the next morning and called me that afternoon. 41 text messages spanning over a year. Renee had known there was some legal process happening. She had not known the medical documents were fabricated. She'd been deceived by her own husband, and that was both the accurate read and the legally relevant one. Marjorie also told me she'd filed a formal complaint with the Tulsa County District Attorney's Office on top of the medical board referral doctor. Whitfield had already made herself. She asked me, "You ready for Thursday?" I said, "I've been ready for Thursday since I was standing on Boston Avenue with that folder under my arm." Michael flew in from Dallas Wednesday night without me asking him to. He called at 3 that afternoon and said he was already booking the flight. He got to Birch Street around 9, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I told him everything, start to finish. He listened the way his mother used to all the way through, no interrupting. When I finished, he looked at the table a second and said, "You okay, Dad?" I said, "I'm functional." He said, "That's not the same thing." I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "Okay, comes after Thursday." I said, "Your mother used to say I was good at taking care of everything, except myself." He said, "She wasn't wrong about much." We talked until almost midnight. I lay awake after, not scared, just wide awake in the particular way you get the night before. Something that matters finally happens. I thought about Carol's spiral notebook in the nightstand. I thought about 34 years of writing everything down, and what it means to keep a habit going long after the reason you started it is gone. Then I slept. Tulsa County District Court on Thursday morning looked like every courthouse looks: beige hallways, bad lighting, decades of other people's worst days soaked into the carpet. Marjorie met me at 8:40. Michael stood next to me. Doctor. Whitfield showed up at 8:45 because Marjorie had asked her to appear in person, and she'd said yes without one single condition attached. At 9, Todd came in with his attorney, a composed-looking man named Gregory Hale, and Todd himself, in a dark suit, put together, calm, the whole presentation of a man who expected to leave that room with exactly what he'd spent 2 years building toward. He saw me in the hallway, and something in his face recalculated fast, then smoothed back over. He said, "Walt, I didn't expect you'd come yourself." I said, "It's a hearing about my mental capacity, Todd. Where else would I be?" He said, "I hope you know, this came from a place of real concern." I said, "I know exactly where it came from." His attorney put a hand on his arm, and they went inside. The judge, the Honorable Diane Alcott, had been on the Tulsa County bench for 11 years and had no patience for proceedings that wasted her morning. She looked over the file, then looked up and said, "This is a dispute regarding a trust amendment filed under the name George I'm Sorry, Walter Coleman. Counsel, identify yourselves." Gregory Hale identified himself for Todd. Marjorie identified herself for me. Judge Alcott looked at Marjorie a moment and said, "I want to confirm, Mr. Coleman is present and understands these proceedings." I said, "I am present, Your Honor, and I requested this exact date be kept." She looked at me with an expression that was carefully neutral, though I thought there was something close to interest underneath it. She said, "Very well, Mr. Hale. Present the basis for the filing." Gregory Hale stood and laid it out in the practiced language of a man who'd done this kind of thing, before referencing the medical evaluation, the clinical letter, the family's concern for an aging widower living alone. He said the physician of record was Dr. Ann Whitfield of Riverside Family Medicine. Judge Alcott looked toward the gallery and said, "Is Dr. Whitfield present?" Ann stood and said, "I am, Your Honor." The judge said, "Are those your documents?" Ann said, "They are not. I never conducted the evaluation described in that letter. I never wrote that letter. I never signed it. I reported the fraudulent use of my credentials to the Oklahoma State Medical Board the same day I learned about this filing, and I've brought that report along with Mr. Coleman's complete 19-year patient file, which contains no cognitive evaluation of any kind." The whole courtroom went still in that particular way. Rooms go still when something real just landed, not dramatic stillness, just people quietly recalculating. Gregory Hale stood frozen at the table. Todd sat beside him, and I watched his face in that exact second, the way I've watched numbers fail to reconcile in 34 years of freight ledgers, That specific moment when a plan and reality stop matching and there's no forcing them back together. What I saw in his face was a man understanding, in real time, that the whole structure he'd built had just come apart at the foundation. Judge Alcott said, "Mr. Hale, I want to be precise. The medical documentation underlying this filing has just been disavowed, under oath, by the physician it claims to be from. Do you have a response?" Gregory Hale said, and his voice had lost its earlier confidence completely. "Your Honor, I was not made aware of any issue with this documentation before today." The judge looked at him, then at Todd. "Mr. Prescott, are you the party who filed this amendment?" Todd stood. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "Are you aware that filing fraudulent documentation with this court and with the county recorder constitutes a criminal offense under Oklahoma law?" Silence. Then Todd said, "Your Honor, I can explain." She said, "I'm sure you can." She looked at his attorney. "Counsel, I'm suspending this proceeding, not dismissing it. I'm referring the fraudulent documentation to the Tulsa County District Attorney for review, and I'm entering a formal notation that the medical basis for this filing has been challenged and disproven by the treating physician herself. Mr. Coleman, I want the record to reflect there is no finding of any kind against you here today, and that the court takes seriously what's been done to you." She looked at Todd once more. "Mr. Prescott, I'd strongly advise you speak with your attorney about what comes next. This court is adjourned." She stood and left, and the room came back to life around us, the way a room does after something like that. Marjorie touched my arm and said, "Quiet." That went exactly the way it needed to. Michael didn't say a word, just put his hand on my shoulder and left it there, which was exactly right. I looked over at the other table. Gregory Hale was leaning in close to Todd, talking fast and low. Todd sat very still, the suit and the haircut and the composure all still technically in place and meaning absolutely nothing now. He wasn't the man who'd walked in an hour earlier. That man had a plan, and 2 years of groundwork under him. This one had none of it left. He looked up once, not really at me, just the involuntary way a person looks around when their whole world just rearranged itself without asking permission. Our eyes caught for a second. I didn't look away. I didn't say anything either. I just looked at him steady, the way a man looks at a number that finally landed exactly where he calculated it would 10 days earlier. Then I picked up my jacket and walked out of that courtroom into a June morning in Tulsa, with my son beside me and my attorney behind me, and the folder that started all of it now sitting in Marjorie's briefcase as evidence in something that was just getting started. The DA's office opened a formal investigation within 2 weeks. Todd was charged in August 2 counts of filing fraudulent documents, 1 count of identity misuse of a medical professional, and 1 count of financial exploitation of an elder, which is the statutory language in this state for exactly what he'd spent 2 years building toward doing to me. He lost his position at the financial planning firm the week the charges became public. They let him go before the ink was dry on the press release. I didn't follow every detail after that because I didn't need to. Renee filed for divorce in September. She brought all 41 messages to Marjorie's office and answered every single question honestly. She's my daughter. There's a difference between being lied to and choosing not to look too hard at something, and I've chosen, for her, to believe it was the first one. She and Caleb live about 15 minutes from Birch Street now. She comes for dinner on Sunday evenings, and she asks a lot more questions than she used to. Michael flew up for the first one. The 3 of us sat around my kitchen table for the first time in longer than I want to admit, without the weight the last year had laid over everything. Renee looked at her plate a second and said, "Dad, Mom knew about him, didn't she? Before any of us did." I said, "Your mother figured people out before most folks finished their first impression." Renee said, "What did she know?" I said, "She knew he did math on everybody he met. She just knew what kind of math it was." Renee sat with that, then said, "I should have asked her more questions, when I still could have." I said, "Ask them now." She left plenty of answers behind if you look. Carol's spiral notebook is still in the nightstand. I haven't moved it. Caleb's t-ball season starts back up in 2 weeks, and I'm still his coach, and Renee brings him by the house most Saturdays after practice, so he can throw the ball around in the backyard under the pecan tree his grandmother planted. The Coleman family trust is back exactly the way Carol and I built it, with Michael named successor trustee and Marjorie Kessler named as backup if anything ever needs a legal hand on it again. Everything that matters is exactly where I put it, and it's all written down somewhere I can find it inside of 20 minutes. I'm 66 years old. I still walk the river trail most mornings. I still do the company's quarterly numbers by hand before anybody's software gets near them, and I still write down every conversation that matters the same day it happens, because that habit is the only reason I'm sitting at my own kitchen table tonight, instead of somewhere I didn't choose, signing checks I didn't write. The documents that said otherwise about me are sitting in a court record now, as evidence in a criminal case. That's the only version of that story that's going to survive. My old man used to say, a man's whole life comes down to what he builds and what he's willing to fight to keep. He drove a delivery route out of Muskogee for 30 years and never had much. But what he had, nobody ever took from him without a fight. And I grew up watching that, the same way you learn anything that actually sticks, not because somebody sat you down and explained it, but because you watched it happen every day until it became part of you. I built something real out of one truck and a folding table. Somebody tried to take it out from under me while I was still grieving my wife. I held on to it with 34 years of habit, one very good attorney, and a doctor who picked up the phone herself before anybody had to ask her to. That's the only inheritance that ever really counted for anything.